All right. Hello and welcome everyone. You are here for the first session of the StriveScan Collegewise College Fair. And we're here for a session. We're going to talk about the role of merit and what it plays in admissions. And we're going to really be viewing it through the lens of two amazing books that I recently read. And we're joined by the authors of each of these books. So the first book is by Melissa Korn, Unacceptable. And I must say, this covers the Varsity Blues scandal in extraordinary depth. And reading through it, my jaw was literally dropping every few minutes because even though I live in Los Angeles and I'm aware of, the audacity with which some, folks approach this process, this took it to the next level. And through it all, I was so impressed with how non-judgmental you were. You were able to keep this very even-keeled tone, which I admit I got a little bit judgy at times. And then we're also joined by the great Jacques Steinberg with the College Conversation, which is a companion for parents to guide their children through the college process. And what I loved, and Jacque, I've shared this with you, I loved it because so much of this seemed to embody the most ideal way in which students and parents would embrace the college admissions process, which of course stood in stark contrast to the way the students and parents in Melissa's book approached the process. And it's also worth noting for any of the counselors out there who are watching today, of course, Jacques Steinberg is the author of the Gatekeepers, which is almost like our, I don't know, it's our seminal text in the world of college admissions in a lot of ways. So it's, if you're a new counselor, I would actually, I don't have a copy of that because in fact, anytime I meet someone who's like, I'm interested in getting into the world of college counseling, I'm like, here's a copy of this book, read it. And so I now realize whoever I last loaned it to never gave me their copy back. So it's the most bought book I probably had in my library at this point. So anyways, thank everyone for joining. You are welcome to put it on to the speaker view if you want to be able to see who's speaking at any given point. And that should, give you a better view of what's going on. But with that, I'm going to go ahead and dive in with our group right here. And I've got my colleague, I should note, my colleague, Casey Neer, who is in the chat box, and she'll kind of be, watching some of the Q&A kind of come in. We're not going to spend a lot of time tackling Q&A up until the end, because I think we have a really nice conversation planned already, but we'll make sure we squeeze in a few moments there. So anyways, hope you can sit back and enjoy with your favorite beverage. I know there are lots of parents here and a few students as well. So Melissa, I want to start off with you simply because I think, the Varsity Blues scandal, we hear that phrase of helicopter parenting pops up a lot. And it's one of these things. This is like helicopter parenting times 1,000 to a certain extent, which is what you kind of learned and revealed in your book. And, Jacque's book as well is speaking directly to parents about how they can think about this process in a healthy way that will allow their child to thrive. I'd love to get a sense, Melissa, from you, what you saw, what was the motivation for these parents? And again, just as a backdrop, for those of you who may, a little quick teaser, Rick Singer, an independent consultant, basically took large sums of money and kind of floated them through athletic departments generally to secure spaces at some of the most selective universities in the country. It only happened a year and a half ago, but it does seem like a lifetime since it first happened. So, Melissa, I'd love for you to just share, like, what was the motivation? What did you get was a sense of motivation for those parents?
Yeah, so you referred to helicopter parents. I think the phrase that actually is even more apt is snowplow parents, which is kind of that next level. So helicopter parents, right? They hover, they whatever, rappel down, and they're there when needed. Snowplow parents just push every problem out of the way before the kid even gets to it. And I think that's what a lot of these parents thought they were doing. some for their own kids, some for themselves. So there are dozens of parents who were charged in this criminal case, or and as you said, these charges were just filed like a year and a half ago. Those who have pleaded not guilty haven't faced trial yet. That's going to happen next spring. So it's still ongoing, even though it feels like a long time ago. Um, and these parents, for a lot of them, it was their own ego. It was this misguided sense of, I need to help my kid get into this particular name brand college because that is a reflection on my skills and my value as a parent, right? Like I'm failing as a parent if my kid doesn't go to Stanford or USC or Georgetown. And part of that was about the culture where they were growing up, a lot in the LA area, the Bay Area, some on the East Coast as well, but just these places where there's something in the air and there's this assumption that there's a very short list of acceptable school destinations, and anything that's not on that very short list is not a place that you would be proud to say your kid went to. There's often talk about bumper sticker envy, and I think a lot of these parents were driven by such a focus on what name was going to be on that bumper sticker, and what it said about them and their family and their abilities, even though so many of the kids would have been just fine no matter where they went because they were from very wealthy families, well-connected families. They could have gone to a state school and been totally fine because there are plenty of very good state schools out there. But you ask any of these parents kind of, what was so wrong with Cal State Northridge, they would just be horrified at that prospect.
No, that's, yes. We talk about the sweatshirts, the bumper stickers, and Jacque, you know what? I'll save it. There's that quote that you have towards the end of your book, which almost speaks directly to what Melissa was talking about. But I'd love, you've had a chance. You've been talking to, you're the parent of college students yourself. You've been talking to high school parents for years now. What is that line that lets some parents just go, you know what, I want this for my kid, but we're going to do it the right way, versus the ones who you've seen kind of stray out of bounds?
Yeah, I mean, I think Melissa carried it beautifully in terms of this. We as parents sort of lose sight of our role and our perspective, and we want our kids to be happy. And a lot of us have tremendously good intent. We want them to have a fabulous experience in higher education, maybe at the school we went to, or maybe at the school that we could have never dreamed to have gone to. As Melissa suggests, we see it as validation. That bumper sticker is like our sort of stamp of approval on us as parents. If my child got into that school, I must have done a good job. And if they didn't, God, what are my neighbors going to think? So in the college conversation, which has the subtitle, A Practical Companion for Parents to Guide Their Children on the Path to Higher Education. First of all, the word "getting in" is not in that title, and it's intended almost as an antidote to the behavior that Melissa documented so beautifully. What if we panned back and tried, if possible, can we remind us all as parents, what's this process ultimately about? Who is your child? What do they value? Maybe you don't know. Maybe you need sort of help in sort of guiding that conversation if they'll have it with you. What are their ideas? What inspires them? What are they seeking out of a higher education? Maybe listen to them a little bit more than sort of impose what you think. And then it's a big world out there, folks. There's more than 2,000 four-year colleges and even more community colleges. Melissa, very tightly sort of talked about the range of institutions. And maybe that alignment between your child and that experience is a better framing than that bumper sticker and that window sticker. I know I'm providing something of an ideal here. But I also think that, sort of warned by what Melissa documented, maybe we all just sort of need to kind of pan back, kind of take a breath and kind of remind ourselves what this is about.
Right. I think what happened in the Varsity Blues case, that didn't exist in a vacuum, right? It wasn't just some bad apples kind of working on their own. They were in this system. They took advantage of a system. Rick Singer, the guy at the middle, absolutely corrupted and took advantage of the system. But it was a system that already existed that allowed people to think this way, encouraged people to think that this was a viable path or a necessary kind of approach for them. Jacque, what you just said about kind of listening to the kids a little bit more, I think that's one of the big takeaways from my book as well. And we spoke to one of the students who was a beneficiary, if you will, of some of these illicit acts. And he's kind of, he went through his story. His father was charged, pleaded guilty, served prison time. And he said that he was disappointed with himself for not speaking up more and not trying to have more of a voice in the process. But it was really hard to, because the parents had so much invested in it. And the parents were, again, tying their own worth to how their kids fared in admissions with a very narrow view of success. But he said, looking back, I wish I had spoken up more. And now here's my chance to, in talking to us for the book. Again, his father didn't give him permission. His father's lawyers didn't give him permission. He just did it. And I think that said a lot about how hungry he was, and I imagine many others teens are, for just to be heard by somebody.
Right.
I mean, Melissa's book, Arun, it almost functions as a mirror on all of us. And I think for the parents who are listening tonight, it's a cautionary tale. It does not have to be your lot. You can take this information, you can note the name of Rick Singer, the name of Lori Loughlin, the name of Felicity Huffman, and you can then sort of take a breath and set about on a different course with your child. If you so choose, with fabulous choices and absolutely options that are attainable, if you're willing to keep an open mind and remind you and your child, what's this really about?
Yeah, no, I was thinking of, there was the quote by Lori Loughlin's husband, I think, where he said something about make sure we have a roadmap for success. But
Anywhere
make sure
but
that
ASU is what
anywhere but ASU. And I mean, those of us in education, ASU is like one of the most remarkable, fantastic institutions at the Arizona State University. And so, for those folks who measure by selectivity, you'd be like ASU, but like those of us in the know are like, this place is transforming the way public education looks. So we've talked a little bit about, were you going to say something, Melissa?
Yeah, I was actually going to ask you a question.
Sure.
So
Journalists.
I'm better at asking. Yeah. So one of the things that I think Jacque and I both try to get at is talking about fit, right? The need to really figure out what a student wants in a school and what kind of school is the right environment for them, the right, urban, rural, subjects that they want to study, extracurricular, size, environment, all that. Do you feel like, as in advising families, that's hard to get through, that fit maybe matters more than ranking? I know that when I talk to people, that's a challenge.
Right. And both of you talk about, I don't want to say nefarious, but how challenging the U.S. News and World Report can be to a healthy, college application process. And certainly, I will say, interestingly enough, I don't know that Varsity Blues shook a lot of students and parents out of just a certain static look of the way they wanted to think about college. But interestingly enough, the pandemic, and I wish Casey, my colleague who's kind of manning the Q&As, was here, because we kind of marveled at the fact that this spring we saw students for the first time really thinking about, what does it mean to go to college? Like, yeah, I'd always planned to go here, but now they're saying I might have to start online, or school might start, but there might not be a football team. And they really had to dig in and think about this idea of fit, urban versus rural, big versus small, the kind of, output they wanted on the other end in terms of graduate school and things like that. And a lot of, I know my friends on the counseling side, we kind of love the fact that some of the conversations we had in April were so different than ones that we had in past years, because it became so much more serious to think about, what does college mean this fall? Because I'm an anthropology major, and over, I have seen a lot of students and parents attack this as simply a ritual. He's turning 18. It's now time to go to college. She's graduated from high school. It's time to go to college. And I think, Jacque, your very first chapter is why college, right?
Yeah, it doesn't assume that we as parents or our children know the answer to the question of why college. And implicit in that is even whether college.
Yes, because you talk about Uncollege, massive online courses. Well, so we've been talking about the parents. I think I would love to get both of your impressions. Jacque, you've been on the board of directors at a point for NACAC, or the national organization. Also, I realized we didn't have the conventional chat box where we normally drop bios. It's worth noting, I mentioned Melissa's a journalist. She is education writer at the Wall Street Journal. And Jacque had a background writing editor of the education section at the New York Times, right?
Yes.
And certainly feel free to add in anything else with your bio. But Jacque, any thoughts on, like, what role do colleges and there's a little bit of a chicken egg thing here. You know, Melissa had this NYU professor talking about how Americans systematically weakened parenting, you know, through the 1990s and the 2000s. And, you know, then you talk about the snowplow removing setbacks and obstacles. Like, do the colleges drive the parents to that, or what's happened here?
Look, I think that, again, as Melissa's book makes clear, there's no shortage of actors who are responsible for all of this, getting to this point with a certain segment of parents and counselor. But you know, do the colleges bear some responsibility? Sure. One factor is certainly the marketing, the flooding, you know, for parents who are on this call, and students too, the flooding of your email boxes, US mailboxes with, you know, glossy materials on why our school. And that can be overwhelming, and it can be seductive. You mentioned the rankings earlier. We're a rankings obsessed culture. You know, we want to rank our refrigerators, and we want to rank movies on Rotten Tomatoes and cell phones, and why not colleges? Except that, as we all know, it's sort of really hard to capture a higher ed institution in a ranking and then order them one on top of the other. And in some cases, a four-way tie for some of these schools. Or why did my alma mater fall 4 notches? Because who knows? But then we as parents too have to bear some responsibility as well, as Melissa's book points out, that we oftentimes with only good intent, get caught up in this ourselves. So I think lots of us responsible, but lots of opportunities for us as parents to sort of, and students too, to sort of pull back and take that breath I mentioned earlier, and start at the beginning on what is the goal of this process, and how step by step might you get to it in a way that involves nothing in terms of the behavior that Melissa has documented.
Yeah, I think there's plenty of blame to cast around. You know, there are a lot of people at fault for kind of getting to this frenzied level. I had one person describe admissions at these uber selective schools as blood sport, which is extreme, but perhaps
dramatic.
Not far off. I actually had more than one person use that phrase. Yeah. And I do think schools do deserve some attention and some perhaps scorn for this. I remember probably 6 or 7 years ago, I wrote an article for the Journal, and the headline was something along the lines of "Colleges rise as they reject." Right, so schools, as Jacque said, you know, send out all these mailers, encourage people to apply, and then reject them, and that makes their admit rate go down. It makes them seem more selective, whether or not that other applicants were qualified. It makes them become kind of a hot school. They move up in the rankings. More people want to apply the next year, and it's this vicious cycle for applicants, but not so vicious for the schools, right? They benefit from it in some ways. All of a sudden, faculty want to go there. Donors who maybe are not alums are thinking, I want to give my money to this rising school. And there's so many upsides for a lot of schools to really engage in some of these not quite so pleasant activities.
And yeah, Arun, you mentioned that I just finished 3 years on the board of the National Association of College Admissions Counseling, which is 14,000 members, many of them admissions officers, as you yourself were, Arun, and also many of them college counselors, including at public high schools. And, you know, prior to my 3 years on that board, I spent 20 years in a role like Melissa's, as you mentioned, at the New York Times, interviewing admissions officers and high school counselors, including for The Gatekeepers, the book you mentioned, where I spent a year embedded at Wesleyan University. And I have to say that it's important for students and parents on this call to know that most of the people who do this work, whether on the admissions side or on the college counseling side at your high school are people of immense integrity, in my experience, who got into this work not because they were trying to make a buck, but because they really cared about access, and they really cared about, Melissa used the word fit, trying to find fit, and making sure that students find places where they can shine and thrive and meet their objectives. Oftentimes that is mathematically impossible, but that might be at a few dozen schools as opposed to at the lion's share of the 2,000 four-year colleges in this country that admit most of the students who apply. But I think it's important for families on the call to know that the people who are going to read your child's application or who are going to advise your child, that they really do go into this with good intent, but it's a really complicated, messy process.
And
Yeah.
you just mentioned the admitting most students, and I think that's something very much worth repeating over and over throughout the process. Most college students attend a school that admit most applicants, right? When we're talking about people going to extreme criminal lengths to get into certain schools, it's really a few dozen schools that are that selective. I mentioned in my book a little bit, there are some schools that are fantastic schools that admit upwards of 60-70% of their applicants. And that doesn't make them bad schools. It just makes them have a slightly wider door. But I think people assume selective means better. It just means selective.
Right. Which is a mistake. And there's a lot of research out there showing students who are like, going to Harvard matters less than being the kind of kid who could possibly get into Harvard. If you're hardworking, smart enough, creative enough to go, I think Harvard might be on my list, actually attending plays very little role in what happens on the other side of college. And economists have studied this through longitudinal studies. There's some famous research done on that. Like, the actual school matters less than a lot of the kind of values and traits that students carry.
There's a lot of discussion of how you go versus where you go, right?
Yes.
If you're going and you're sitting in the back of a 200-person lecture hall for every class for 4 years,
Yep.
So what if you're going to an Ivy? But if you're going to a school where you're engaging in research, you go to office hours, you're involved in extracurriculars, that's a fulfilling college experience.
And as you go through the search, it is possible to put those values, Melissa, that you said, kind of front and center as a parent and a student. As you look at colleges, how do they register on some of those metrics? Not the average or median SAT score of the kids on the way in, but what's the experience while students are there? How accessible are professors? How open are they on their office hours? How big is the average class size? How available are counselors or tutoring centers? These are questions that students and families can ask that are sort of window sticker proof. They get below the level of the window sticker.
Yep. Those questions, going back to your question to me, Melissa, those questions Jacque brought up were exactly the conversations we were able to have in April. This whole idea of I think Jacque's got an entire section on learning styles, right, in the book. I think a lot of students and parents don't think about that, right? And at its core, it's still school. It's kind of important that you find a good fit there. And we were able to have those wonderful conversations. And I hope that's continuing here through the fall, which I believe it is. And I hope it continues through next year. I think, going back to even the title of this session where we're talking about this idea of merit, and, what does merit look like after Varsity Blues scandal, or, when we're in the middle of a pandemic recession where we know people's economics are different? Jacque, I'd love to start with you. Any thoughts on, like, is merit still a thing, or is it now entirely just transactional, where how many hours of community service and tuition dollars can you bring?
Yeah, I guess I still think that that merit matters, but I think that we as students and families and counselors have to know that that definition is elastic. That the definition of merit, it depends on the institution that your child or you may be interested in, and also who is the particular applicant whose application is on the table, if you will, at that moment, and what's their background. These, if we think about the admissions process and admissions officers as trying to build these almost utopian communities on their campuses, they're looking for young people who will bring an enormous number of qualities and experiences and backgrounds to their campuses. I mean, first and foremost, they want to make sure that your child can do the work. The last thing they want is to set your child up for failure. And to your point, Arun, with some grades pass-fail in the spring in high school junior year, and pass-fail perhaps this fall, with standardized tests optional and sometimes almost impossible to take or to take at risk to your health, that definition of merit is going to have to stretch a little bit. Maybe what your teachers say about you in their recommendation of you is going to rise a little bit in sort of where that factors into the definition of merit. What you say about yourself in your essay. But the fundamentals of this process are still the same for those applying this fall as in the past. The things that they value you at the University of Chicago, among other steps, as an admissions officer, practice the holistic admissions process, looking at the whole child, looking at the whole student, and that process will take place again. But it's going to require probably a little more effort on the part of admissions officers in what that definition of merit looks like within a pandemic. But the last point I'll make is that students and parents, you should be confident that at these institutions to which your child will apply, they will have the floor to make the case for themselves in terms of what they would bring to that community. Something like their essay, in all likelihood, will be read by 2 admissions officers and perhaps by a subcommittee, if not the entire admissions committee, and they will have the floor. And I think it's important to go into this process not with sort of a defeatist attitude, but with the opportunity to make your best case, and that's within your control.
Yeah. And Melissa, like a lot of the parents in your book, I think Jacques brings up like a view of the world that I share. I'm friends with many of, admissions officers from my former life on that side, and they're good, earnest people. And, to many people in the world of admissions, it's never felt like an admissions scandal. It was more of, oh, it's a side sporting thing. So
you're
that's
just repeating that line from the NACAC conference, aren't you?
Well, yeah. I mean, so that cynicism, do you share that idealism that the two of us have in terms of merit? Like, can just regular kids still get a fair shake without having to travel halfway across the world and find a cure for leukemia or.
Yes, with an asterisk next to it. I think overall, yes, but it's not as easy to get into some of these schools as it was 15, 20 years ago. It's just different. There's a different volume of applications. A lot of admissions offices read differently than they used to a few decades ago in terms of splitting up an application. Each, 2 people, one looks at kind of academics and teacher recs, other looks at extracurriculars, and no single person reads the entire application at certain schools. Kind of being aware that this can happen. This can be a 10, 15-minute process reviewing an application, and that's it. And for something that your teen is putting so many hours of work into, years of work into, that's sometimes hard to stomach. But strength of schedule, grades, did you take the hardest classes your high school offered, or did you get all A's and easy gut classes? Like, that still matters more than anything else. Test scores don't really matter much this year, if at all. At many schools, they recognize that many students just couldn't take the tests, and they won't be penalized for that. APs, I think those aren't going to matter all that much because they were so odd this spring, offered online, short, 45 minutes in and out. I still remember with awful vivid detail my own AP exams in high school. So it's a very different year. And I think Jacques is right that, essays, recommendations, those will matter more. The kind of more qualitative assessments of students will matter more because we don't have some of those quantitative things on which schools have relied in the past. I am cynical, though. I do think it will be very hard for schools to ignore things like geography, right?
Mm-hmm.
A lot of schools were hurt by taking students from far across the country or around the world, and then they couldn't or wouldn't come to campus this fall if a school did reopen in person. They just didn't want to fly and be in a hotspot zone. They couldn't get a visa, things like that. That's a real concern. So I think schools want to play it a little safer. They might rely more on early admission, early decision in particular, the binding option, right? They want to have students be committing to them as early as possible. I think most schools are not need blind. Those that are may end up with turning to their wait lists more and kind of playing it that way, because a lot of schools are only need aware on their wait lists, kind of ways of gaming that around the edges a little bit. I don't think a school that says it's need blind will all of a sudden just kind of walk away from that in the middle of the admission cycle. They will have already said something if that was the route they were going. But the idea of a family that can pay full tuition right now, or pay full tuition and acknowledge, oh, we're really into the arts, and we've noticed that your performing arts center is looking a little run down, and we generally make 6-figure gifts each year or something. That's really hard for a school to ignore when they're facing multi-million, $100 million deficits.
Yep.
So the cynic in me kind of thinks, yes, money will play more of a role than it has in the past, which is kind of ironic after everything that happened in Varsity Blues.
Right.
But I do think at its core, admissions is still grounded in kind of an assessment of merit, but it is not a pure meritocracy and never has been.
Yeah, I think the key for students and families in sort of navigating the universe that Melissa's talking about is a balanced list. And that's obviously where organizations like Collegewise come in, making sure that, look, if you're going to go for it at some of these highly selectives where, as Melissa points out, it's harder to get into than perhaps when I was applying in the mid 80s. But if your list has balance, and if you keep in mind that it's a big universe of schools and that there are plenty of schools where it's actually not especially hard to get in, and where there's a fabulous education to be had that's affordable and that may well align with what your child is seeking and may align with geographically and what have you, I think the list is critical, and not to be a list of schools that is top heavy with those sort of schools where they're going to have single digit admit rates.
Right. And I think both of you, I've read your work in the past, like in the newspapers. You both of you interview people who aren't at just highly selective schools. You're talking to kids who are at schools with more modest selectivity. And those kids love where they are just as much. They're still learning organic chemistry and going to medical school. They're still heading off to law school. And I think that's something that can get lost in this kind of race to the top to a certain extent.
Look, what are you going to do as a student? One thing, we might say as parents to our children as we sort of advise in the college conversation, what are you going to get out of this experience? How are you going to leverage as a student, as a child, the opportunities at this institution, as opposed to what's that institution going to do for me?
Yeah.
I think as you zoom ahead to an employer looking at a resume and a reference to where a student went to school, what you got out of that experience is probably for many employers going to be more important than where that experience took place.
Yeah. Well, you've gone through this admissions process. You've looked at it closely, and I'm thinking back to a section of Melissa's book where, there were parents who were just like, there were many quotes that were tough to stomach where parents just didn't trust their kids. They were just like, I don't think she can get this done, or I don't think he can pull off what needs to be done. So I'm going to step in here. And it's the one quote I really want to read because I loved it so much from your book, where you say, it may be small comfort, but remember that this process is not predictable, and it should never be viewed as a report card on your parenting or your child's self-worth. Whatever judgments are made in the admissions process are ultimately subjective and human. So I think there'll be parents and students who hear that and then forget about it once in another 15 minutes when they're into the session with some selective universities. Share a little bit of how you know, as someone who's gone through this, you've approached it from so many angles at this point. How do you reassure those parents and students out there it's going to be okay?
Yeah, and I don't want to be Pollyanna-ish. I mean, I don't
Yeah.
want to be, I've been there, and we're all human, as are the people involved in this process. We are too. And we get carried away. And one of the things that Melissa's book shows is the links that we will go to try to control something that may well be uncontrollable. And I hope the parents listening don't think it's naive to sort of, sort of that acknowledgement that there are lots of parts of this process that we can control, but also those parts that we can't. I think that's something of a relief, and to sort of acknowledge it, and to focus, at least at the front end of the process, on those things that you can control. What are going to be the ground rules, the guardrails between you and your child in terms of what's your role going to be in this process, what's their role going to be in this process. Is it possible in your relationship that you could actually have this conversation and maybe even set some of those rules and boundaries to writing that you might adhere to? When are you going to talk about this process as a family? Is it going to be every night at dinner, or can we keep it to maybe one or two nights? Who's going to be part of the process? Are siblings going to be part of it? Are grandparents, or can we kind of keep it a little more close? And so I think that I think there are lots of words of comfort in the book. If you're willing to keep an open mind, and if you're willing to sort of constantly remind each other what's most important, what's my role, what's not my role.
I do think at some point, and it's very hard to do, as you say, and people might hear this now and then 15 minutes later forget it, that there is so much you can't control. Like, you can put forward the best application and still not get in. And if you read the press releases that many of these most selective schools put out every spring, they talk about the quality of the class, how the caliber of the applicants and admitted students. And a few will say, we could have filled our class twice over with perfect SAT scores. We could have, taken 3 times as many students who had 4.0 GPAs, but that's not all they're looking for. And sometimes it's, goodness, the wind ensemble is looking a little light this year. We had a bunch of graduates, or the marching band, or we want to make sure that we have more fine arts students, or chemists, or aspiring geologists, or whatever it is. And if your kid isn't that, that's just the way it is. And it's hard to admit that you can't control the outcome here.
Right.
But I think once you do come to terms with that and remind yourself, like, okay, I did the best I could do, it's out of my hands now, then
Yep.
when those decision letters do come, it's kind of, you're able to take it a little bit more in stride.
Right. Well, and
Really try to stop yourself from sort of asking those questions like Melissa suggests, where, as a parent, you want to call up Yale and ask how many tuba players are graduating in the senior class. And that can be really, really dangerous and perilous in trying to do these folks' jobs for them and try to handicap this from the outside. If that list is balanced, if your child sort of puts forth who they are, and has a list of schools where there's potential alignment with their interests, at a certain point, you have to kind of let the chips fall where they may, knowing that there are some schools on that list that they're almost certainly going to get into, and if they've done this right, that they want to attend.
Right. I will
Yeah.
say one of the kind of worst things you can do is have one single favorite school and think that that's the only place you can be happy, because there are so many others. And as Jacques said, you want every school on your list to be a place that you want to go to.
Yep.
It shouldn't just be a safety school backup, last, worst case scenario destination, because if you really want to spend 4 years there,
Right.
but to really appreciate something about each of the schools on the list. I didn't get into my top choice school. I was absolutely gutted. Asked all those questions. Why not? What did I do wrong? All of that. I ended up at another school on my list that ended up being a much better fit for me. But in that moment, I know that it's so hard to see it.
Right. Well, and it gets back to the original first chapter of Jacque's book, Why College, right? And if you have a clear sense of why you want to go to college and what would make for a powerful experience, you're going to build a list where, yes, even if you don't get into some of those schools with pretty aspirational admit rates, you're still going to be pretty satisfied, maybe not absolutely delighted, but I can tell you as a college counselor, I have students who don't get into their top choices, and they head off to, maybe what was third or fourth on their list with a promise of, Arun, you'll hear from me during Thanksgiving or the winter break, because I'm definitely going to be filling out my transfer applications. And they call me and I'm like, really? And they're just like, oh, I was an idiot in April. I had no idea what I was talking about. I love where I am. I would never transfer. Things have worked out perfectly. That's what happens 98 out of 100, 100 times. And then the other 2 times, it's a kid who does want to transfer, or they're in Boston and it turns out to be way colder than living in Los Angeles. So, there's that as well. We did have one question, Melissa, that Casey wasn't able to tackle, that I wanted to throw to you really quickly. What's the difference between what the Varsity Blues parents did and then what those wealthy donors did to endow buildings and, the parents who are development cases? What's the difference between the differences in connections and legacies, in your words?
Yeah, so I think the short answer is fraud. But the longer answer is a lot of the actions that took place in the Varsity Blues scandal are kind of at the far end of a spectrum of behavior that some of these things, some other things on that spectrum are quite common, right? There are so many privileges and inequities baked into the system. People can afford SAT tutors, people can afford independent counselors, people can afford tuition at fancy private schools. People can afford to send their kid off to do a volunteer trip in Guatemala for a summer. People can afford, private coaching and private violin lessons and all of that. Then there's kind of the group of people who can afford to endow a building or a professorship or have connections, their legacies, or their uncle is best friends with the dean of admissions. And then there's the stuff that Varsity Blues have. And we have a chapter in the book called The Gray Area. And it's really about how some of those lines are a little blurred. But essentially in the Varsity Blues case, these families, with the help of Rick Singer, were in most cases pitching a non-athlete as a star soccer player or rower or sailor. There's a fraud part, bribing a coach or somebody else to take that person on as a recruit, and then they got into the school. So it's not quite as clear cut as made a donation and my kid is also qualified, right? Not every development case is unqualified. Not every legacy is unqualified. I think we have to remember that sometimes. But Varsity Blues just took it to such an extreme with just pitching these students as people that they weren't.
Yeah. Thank you. That I think that draws a little bit of a brighter line. We've got a couple minutes here. I'd love for each of you quickly to kind of share. Did you have a favorite chapter of your own book that you loved working on, chapter or story? I certainly had my own, but Jacque, if I can.
Yeah, so I should say I wrote the College Conversation in partnership with a co-author, and it's Eric Furta, who's the Dean of Admissions at the University of Pennsylvania, who's been a source of mine as a journalist for many years. And again, this is not a guide to how to get into the University of Pennsylvania or an Ivy. It's the sum total of everything that Eric and I sort of have learned on the job that we hope to impart to parents, sort of assuming no knowledge about how to guide through this process. So when you ask about a favorite section, Arun, we have a section on discovery, which is really helping your child sort of discover themselves. There's the search process, the application, the decision, and then the transition to college. In the application section, we had a fun section, which Melissa, you would have loved being a part of, in that I provided advice on the essay from the perspective of a narrative nonfiction writer. And then Eric provided advice from the perspective of a professional reader. He's read tens of thousands of essays. He knows what sort of resonates with him. And we had fun. I mean, our lenses were so different in that section on the essay. And yet I think taken together, our hope was that that would be helpful to parents as they tried to help guide their children through the essay, if their children would allow them to help guide them through the essay.
Awesome. Thank you. Loved your book.
Thank
Melissa?
So I also wrote Unacceptable with a co-author, Jennifer Levitz. She is also a reporter at the Wall Street Journal. I will say two very, very quick, because I see Courtney is back on. The first is a chapter about the people who were kind of the real victims of this, the students whose photos were taken and used to pitch somebody else to get into a school, and who never had these schools on their radar because they grew up in, you know, rural Northern California or rural Texas, and it's just, that wasn't part of their vocabulary. It wasn't something their high schools even talked about. The other part was actually the opening scene of the book, where we did kind of the takedown, and we have a bunch of these famous people sitting in jail cells.
Yes. Thanks, Melissa. I really appreciate you two joining us. Thank you to all the students and parents. I hope we've got a couple other great sessions taking place in hundreds of colleges. So get out there, explore, and this really can be a positive, healthy experience. Thank you.
Thank you so much for joining us. As you close out tonight, there's a quick 4-question survey, so hopefully you'll be able to provide us with some feedback. As Arun said, please sign up for additional sessions. You can find those at www.strivescan.com/collegewise. Within a week, recording of the session will be posted on that same website. Have a great night, everyone.